When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I asked my dad a question that I didn't realize would shape the way I see the world for the rest of my life. I looked at him and I said, Dad, if I'm looking through a telescope at a planet that's like a million light years away, say, and I can actually see people on it, right? Living their lives, going through their day. But I understand that it's taken a million years for that image to reach my eyes. Then those people are long dead. But I'm watching their lives unfold right in front of me. So they're both alive in my perception and dead in reality. And if that's true, then what does that really say about time? If it looks like it's happening right now, but it actually happened a million years ago, what even is time? What is space? How does any of that make any sense? Instead of laughing or brushing it off, he sat down and tried, as best he could, to explain Einstein's theory of relativity to a kid who still slept with an ET doll. I didn't understand the science, but I felt something open up. Like the world had seams, and you could tug on them if you were brave enough. Years later, in my senior year of high school, I was experimenting with psychedelics, LSD, and reading books that hit me at exactly the right or wrong time. Two in particular changed everything for me: Slaughterhouse-Five and Siddhartha. Slaughterhouse-Five hit me like a freight train. The way Vonnegut handled time, I mean, non-linear, fractured, looping, it made more sense to me than the straight line that I was taught to believe in. Siddhartha, well, it provided an adjunct to difference in material Western individualism and Eastern spiritual collectivism. Well, then, around the same time I read Slaughterhouse-Five, Pulp Fiction came out. Right? Another fracture in the idea that reality has to be linear or singular. Now, here's actually the funniest part. The reason I picked up Slaughterhouse-Five in the first place was because it was the book banned by the school in Footloose. The ridiculous 80s movie about dancing accidentally led me to one of the concepts that would shape my entire philosophy and the way I would think decades later. Now, I didn't know it then. But what I was bumping into was psychedelics, Vonnegut, relativity, Tarantino, was the postmodern condition. The sense that reality isn't clean, time isn't simple, identity isn't singular, and truth isn't handed down from on high. It's shattered. It's layered. It's contextual. And most of us are trying to navigate it with a map drawn for a world that no longer exists. But it all started with that moment in the driveway staring up at the stars. That question, that sense that reality wasn't as neat or singular or linear as adults pretended it was. Now here's the thing. You don't have to stare through a telescope or read Kurt Vonnegut to have that moment. Because life has a way of cracking your worldview open whether you ask for it or not. It happens through heartbreak, a recovery, or success that feels empty, or a loss that makes no sense. Anything that forces you to question the story you were handed. And when that moment hits, you realize something most people feel but don't know how to name. The world no longer runs on one truth, one identity, or one narrative. We're navigating a reality full of multiple signals, multiple selves, and multiple stories, all at once. This isn't a flaw. It isn't chaos. It isn't society falling apart. It's simply the world we live in now. The real question, the one nobody teaches us, is how do you lead yourself in a world with no single story to hold on to? And that's where we begin today. Welcome to Food on the Mind, Awaken Genius, where we break free from food obsession, unlock our potential, and build a life worth living. I'm Jeb Stuart Johnston, and here we dig into the psychology, philosophy, and strategy behind lasting change. Because transformation isn't just about what's on your plate, it's about what's on your mind. If you're here, thank you. And if you find this episode valuable, hit subscribe, leave a review, or tap like if you're watching this on YouTube. It helps more than you know. Now, before we go any further, I want to name something up front. This conversation turned into more than a single episode could responsibly hold. So what you're listening to right now is part one of a two-part exploration. In this first episode, I'm not trying to give you answers. I'm trying to give you language. Language for why so many people feel fragmented. Language for why the old rules don't work anymore. Language for why discipline, motivation, and just try harder keep failing in a world that no longer runs on one story. This episode is about understanding the terrain, the cultural conditions, the philosophical shift, the psychological cost of living in a postmodern world with a nervous system that was never trained for it. The second episode is where we talk about what to do with all this. How to build a center, how to lead yourself, how to live with integrity inside complexity instead of collapsing under it. For now, let's slow down and name the problem clearly. Because until you understand the landscape you're standing on, every solution feels like it's missing the point. Now, let's get into what we're really talking about today. Because that moment I described, that early question about time and perception, that wasn't just a quirky childhood thought experiment. It was the beginning of something I didn't have language for at the time. The realization that reality isn't as fixed as we pretend. And today, that matters more than ever. We're living in a world where identity, it isn't singular. Truth, it isn't agreed upon. Information is now infinite and contradictory. And people are desperately trying to build stable lives inside of these unstable narratives. Most of us feel this shift, but we don't have a framework to understand it. We just feel overwhelmed, fractured, dysregulated, burnt out, pulled in 10 different directions, and we blame ourselves for it. We think we're failing because we lack discipline. We think we're broken because we can't follow a routine. We think we're weak because our motivation swings wildly from day to day. But the truth is simpler and heavier. We're trying to navigate a postmodern reality using tools built for an older world, a world that assumed just one truth, one identity, one simple story. One self, one path. The world doesn't exist like that anymore. And it hasn't for a long time. And yet most of the self-help industry, the wellness industry, the coaching industry still talks to you as if you're one single, unified, stable being who just needs more grit and better habits. It's not how humans work. And it's definitely not how humans work now. So today's episode is the beginning of a multi-part series on understanding the modern self. Part one, and its adjunct, which will come later, is the postmodern self, the loss of a single cohesive identity. Part two will be the neoliberal body, how optimization culture hijacks your humanity. And part three will be the algorithmic self, how external forces shape who you think you are. But first, we have to understand the landscape we're actually living in. And that starts with this truth. You are already a postmodern self. And until you understand what that means, you will always feel like you're fighting invisible forces. So let's get into why. So here's where I want to start today. Right after that opening moment about time and perception, we are already living in a postmodern body. Not a postmodern idea, not a theory, a body. A nervous system, a psychology, an identity shaped by the conditions of this moment in history. And most people don't realize that the way they struggle, the way they react, the way they numb, the way they avoid, the way they overthink, the way they fragment is not simply personal weakness. It's the natural outcome of living in a world where the old rules don't apply anymore. We were raised inside a modernist script, a simple one. One truth, one identity, one path. one self, one version of success. But we're living inside of a postmodern reality, right? Multiple truths, multiple identities, multiple paths, multiple definitions of meaning, and a self made of parts, not a single unified whole. And this mismatch, this collision between the world we inherited and the world we actually live in, is the source of so much of the psychological distress people experience today. Because here's the real shock for most people. Your nervous system knows you're living in a postmodern world, even if your beliefs haven't caught up yet. Your body responds to information overload. It responds to contradictory expectations. It responds to fragmented identities. It responds to constant comparison. It responds to cultural instability. It responds to the collapse of shared meaning. It responds to the pressure to craft a self instead of simply being one. Your body is reacting to the conditions of the era, not just your personal history. And this is why people feel overwhelmed and scattered and dysregulated and unmotivated and ashamed, like they can't pull it together. It's not that you're malfunctioning. It's that the template you were given for how to be a person no longer matches the terrain you're walking on. Let me say that again, because this is the heart of this entire series. You are trying to live as if the world is still modernist, when the actual landscape is postmodern. You were taught that identity is stable, right? That meaning is stable, that truth is stable, that self is stable. But your lived experience says that identity shifts and meaning evolves and truth depends on context and the self is a system. And your body feels the friction between these two worlds. This is why so many people feel like they're meeting resistance everywhere they go. Their nervous system is trying to operate a 2025 psyche with a 1950s operating manual. Artists have been mapping this terrain long before the rest of us realized we were standing on shifting ground, and long before these ideas were ever formally codified as philosophy. That's why I'll be bringing my friend Lance Routson into this series, not necessarily to explain things, but to widen the frame. He's an abstract artist who spent years studying how art functions as pedagogy in a postmodern world. Because the moment you understand that fragmentation isn't a personal flaw, but a cultural condition, the shame around, why can't I get my life together, starts to dissolve. You stop treating your inner world like a malfunction and start seeing it as the natural response to a reality that won't hold still. Artists feel cultural cracks long before society names them. They express them visually, sonically, narratively. They show the fragmentation we're all living with long before psychologists can catch up. Where I come at this from the side of the psyche and the nervous system, Lance comes at it from image, sound, memory, disruption, the language of meaning itself. But I'll let him speak for that when he joins me. Right now, what I want you to see is this. Your struggles make sense in the context of the world you're actually living in. If you feel torn between competing desires, that's postmodern identity. If you feel overwhelmed by contradictory information, that's postmodern epistemology. If you feel directionless, that's postmodern meaning collapse. If you feel like you're performing rather than living, that's postmodern selfhood. You're not failing to be a coherent, unified person. You're simply living in a world where coherence is no longer guaranteed. Where identity isn't something you inherit, it's something you assemble. Where meaning is no longer fixed, it's crafted. Where the self isn't a singular force, it's a negotiation. This is not a moral problem. This is not a character problem. This is a philosophical problem being experienced through the body. And until you understand that, you'll keep misdiagnosing your own struggles. You'll think you lack discipline when what you really lack is integration. You'll think you're weak when what you really are is overloaded. You'll think you're all over the place when what's actually happening is that the world is pulling you in 10 directions at once. You'll think you're inconsistent when you're actually just plural. You'll think you're failing when the truth is you're trying to carry a complexity no one ever trained you to hold. And that's what this episode is here to do, to teach you how to hold it. So next we want to talk about what postmodernism actually says. And this is the real version, right? Like not the Twitter-scape version. So now that we've established the landscape, the fact that we're living in a world where old maps no longer applied, we need to get really clear on something that most people misunderstand. What the hell is postmodernism actually even talking about, right? People throw this word around as if it's some kind of cultural boogeyman. But the truth is, most of its critics have never read a single postmodern thinker. They're fighting an idea that they don't even understand. So let's strip away the noise and get down to what postmodernism actually says. Not the caricature, not the political spin, not the culture war version, the real version. And the real version is surprisingly simple. Number one, postmodernism says that there is no single story that explains everything. Modernism, the worldview that shaped the 20th century, believed in big universal narratives. Religion, nation, science, progress, morality, personal responsibility, discipline, self-control. One story, one truth, one explanation for how to live. Postmodernism just says no single narrative can carry the complexity of human experience anymore. That's it. It doesn't say truth doesn't exist. It doesn't say reality isn't real. It says that one story can't be the story for everyone. And honestly, you don't need a philosophy degree to feel how true that is. Look at your own life. Think of how many versions of you've had to become. Think of how many identities you've carried. How many shifts, ruptures, reinventions. Your life can't be contained by one story. Why would the world be any different? Part two of this is that truth is contextual, not absent, not arbitrary, but contextual. This is the part people love to distort. Postmodernism doesn't say nothing is real. It says truth depends on perspective, language, culture, power, and context. Here's the easy example. Ask 5 nutrition coaches what eating healthy means. You'll get 5 different truths, each backed by research, anecdotes, and client success stories. It's not chaos, that's context. Ask someone dealing with trauma what safety feels like. Ask a burned out executive. Ask a single mom. Ask someone in a depressive episode. Ask someone on the best day of their life. Truth shifts depending on the vantage point. If you've ever argued with someone and realized you're both right, well, that's postmodernism. If you've ever had 2 voices inside you with totally different opinions, that's postmodernism, inside the psyche. Truth is real, but it's not one size fits all. Point 3, the self is multiple, not singular. So postmodernism says the self is not a single, unified, consistent entity. It is a collection of parts, roles, desires, histories, and identities. Look at your own behavior. There's a part of you that wants change, a part that wants comfort, a part that sabotages, a part that protects, a part that performs, a part that rebels, a part that leads, a part that hides. You don't have a self. You have a system of selves. And I want to be very clear here. That is not pathology. This is humanity. Internal family systems knows this. Buddhism knows this. Artists know this. Addicts know this. Parents know this. Trauma survivors know this. Anyone who's ever wanted 2 opposite things at once knows this. But most self-help advice still talks to people as if they're one unified, consistent being. And that mismatch creates shame, confusion, and the illusion of failure. Point 4, nobody is objective. not even the people who swear they are. This might be the most important point for anyone working in health, fitness, coaching, or psychology. Postmodernism says every lens has fingerprints on it. There is no God's eye view. Coaches are influenced by their training, their trauma, their biases, their cultural background, their identity, their incentives, their communities. Scientists are influenced by funding sources, institutional pressures, theory preferences, cultural assumptions, personal blind spots. And you, the listener, are influenced by your upbringing, your nervous system, your history, your fears, your desires, your interpretations, your emotional state. Nobody is neutral. Nobody is untouched by context. Nobody stands outside of their own story. The best any of us can do is acknowledge that, not pretending it doesn't exist. So, what does all this mean for actual human beings? It means this. Postmodernism isn't wrong. It's just incomplete, right? Like anything. It can diagnose the fractures in the world. It can expose the cracks in identity. It can reveal the instability in truth. It can dismantle the illusion society runs on. But it can't really put anything back together. It can tell you why everything is falling apart, but it can't really tell you how to live inside the collapse. And that's what the rest of the episode, and really this entire trilogy, is for. Because if you can understand the forces shaping your inner world, you can stop blaming yourself for feeling fractured and start learning how to lead the system within you. So up until this point, we've talked about the fractures, the cracks in the modern worldview, the multiplicity of identity, the instability of truth. But I want to shift gears here because postmodernism isn't just a breakdown, it's also a breakthrough. For all the chaos, confusion, and complexity it introduces, there are real gifts inside this worldview. Gifts that people overlook because they're too busy arguing about the politics around it. So let's talk about where postmodernism actually helps us, where it validates human experience in a way the old frameworks never could. Well, for one, it frees people from rigid, oppressive identities. The modern world sold us a lie that you're supposed to be one thing consistently forever. One identity, one path, one purpose, one life script. I mean, hell, one career, one job. And if you didn't fit the script socially, emotionally, culturally, psychologically, the problem was you. Postmodernism disrupts that. It says you can be more than one thing. You can evolve. You can contradict yourself and still be whole. You can carry multiple truths without being dishonest. This is a massive relief for people who never felt at home in the identities they were handed. It gives people permission to stop trying to be a singular idea of themselves and actually explore the self as it really is. So this is where my inner conflict work really shines, because once people stop pretending to be oneself, they can finally meet the parts that have been there all along. Next, it legitimizes complexity instead of punishing it. One of the most emotionally damaging messages people internalize is, why can't you just be consistent? Which is modernist code for, why can't you be simpler? But humans aren't simple. Lives aren't linear. Healing isn't tidy. Motivation isn't a straight line. Postmodernism says complexity is not failure. Complexity is human. People aren't inconsistent because they're broken. They're inconsistent because they're living systems responding to changing conditions. If you've ever felt like you contradict yourself, or that you want two opposite things, that you outgrow old parts of yourself, that you don't know which version of you is the real one, congratulations. That's not dysfunction. That's being alive in the 21st century. When clients realize this, the shame drops out of their system. The self-judgment loosens. They stop viewing their inner world as defective, and they start seeing it as dynamic. So third, Postmodernism makes room for trauma, history, and lived experience. Modernism didn't want to hear about your childhood or your nervous system or the way your body remembers pain. It wanted you to be rational, disciplined, self-controlled. And if you struggled, well, sorry, that's a moral issue. Postmodernism says context matters. Your story matters. Your body matters. Your history matters. It acknowledges that trauma shapes behavior, that culture shapes identity, that language shapes emotion, power shapes perspective, environment shapes possibility. This is the foundation of nervous system intelligence. Your body isn't separate from your meaning making. Your body is not an obstacle to change. It is the change. Postmodernism gives us the psychological room to validate that emotional overwhelm, that dysregulation, that grief, that internal conflict, that ambiguity, the parts of ourselves we once disowned. Without shame, without pretending these things don't exist. Next, it explains why people feel fractured, overwhelmed, and just not themselves. Right, if you feel like the world is moving faster than your identity can keep up with, I sure do, right? You're not imagining it. If you feel like you're constantly adapting to new expectations, you're not imagining it. If you feel like you can't hold one stable version of yourself, you're not imagining it. Postmodernism says, of course you feel fragmented. The world is fragmented. Of course you feel pulled in multiple directions. Identity itself is multidirectional now. Of course you feel overwhelmed. Meaning doesn't come prepackaged anymore. But instead of leaving you stuck in that fragmentation, this is where the framework of the Awakened Genius Blueprint becomes essential. Because postmodernism describes the conditions, but your work offers the response. It gives people a way to cultivate inner leadership, internal coherence, emotional grounding, direction, meaning, inside a world that no longer supplies those things by default. And this is where things start to open up. Because once you stop treating complexity as a personal failure, it becomes something you can actually work with. Something you can lead, something that can make you stronger instead of smaller. Complexity isn't the enemy. It's the material you're made of. Because postmodernism isn't just a diagnosis. It's an invitation. An invitation to build a self, not inherit one. An invitation to lead your inner system, not fight it. An invitation to create meaning, not wait for someone to hand it to you. And an invitation to stop pretending that the world is simpler than it is. This is where the part where postmodernism supports us. It frees us. It expands us. But, and this is the turn, it can't take us the whole way. Because if all you do is dismantle, question, deconstruct, and destabilize, you end up with clarity, yes, but no structure, no direction, no rebuilding. And that's where most people get stuck. Which brings us to the next section, where postmodernism fails us. So far, we've talked about what postmodernism reveals, right? The cracks, the multiplicity, the freedom, the complexity. And all that matters. It explains so much of why people feel the way they do. But now we have to talk about the part nobody wants to acknowledge. Postmodernism can take things apart, but it can't put anything back together. And that's where it starts to fail us. Because once you've dismantled the old narratives, once you've questioned the big explanations, once you've broken the illusion of a single self, a single truth, a single meaning, you're left standing in a kind of psychological freefall. You can see everything, but you can't hold anything. Let me walk you through where this worldview breaks down. For one, it's brilliant at deconstruction, and it's terrible at reconstruction. Postmodernism is a master critic. It can dissect a worldview, expose the power structures behind it, peel back the assumptions, basically point to all the places where the story doesn't line up with reality. Once it's done tearing things down, it shrugs. It leaves you with nothing is absolute. Everything is interpretation. Every narrative has holes. Every truth has a counter-truth. Okay, fine. But how do you live like that? How do you build a life? How do you make choices? How do you form an identity? How do you commit to anything? You can't rebuild a worldview out of critique alone. At some point, you do need some structure, some direction, some coherence, a center. And postmodernism kind of refuses to give you one. Next, the endless skepticism sometimes collapses into quiet nihilism. Once you start questioning everything, it becomes very easy to believe in nothing. Not in the dramatic teenage, oh, nothing matters way. Most people never say that out loud. But in the quieter, more dangerous form, where nothing feels meaningful enough to commit to, where everything feels uncertain, where purpose becomes slippery, where decisions feel way heavier than they should, where you second guess every decision and direction you take, where your identity starts to feel optional, unstable, replaceable. It's nihilism in its modern form, not despair, but drift. And if your nervous system is already overwhelmed or dysregulated, that drift becomes a free fall. You feel untethered, unsure, always scanning, never settling. Skepticism without grounding turns into anxiety, and anxiety without meaning turns into collapse. Postmodernism opens the door to that collapse and offers nothing to hold on to on the way down. Next, without shared truth, people cling to tribes as a survival strategy. When the big story collapses, people don't become enlightened. They become scared. And scared people look for belonging. That's how diet culture becomes religion. That's how fitness communities become identity. That's how political factions become personality. That's how self-help gurus become prophets. People aren't looking for truth. They're looking for certainty. They're looking for a narrative that feels solid enough to stand on. But when you choose a tribe out of fear, the tribe ends up choosing your identity for you. And suddenly, your sense of self is outsourced to algorithms and influencers and movements and ideologies and microcultures and online communities. And the more fractured the world becomes, the harder you cling. Postmodernism explains why this is happening, but it doesn't help you step out of it. Next issue is that fragmentation without leadership, it just turns into paralysis. Multiplicity is not the problem. Humans have always been multiple. The problem is multiplicity without a leader. When the self is made of parts with different desires, fears, wounds, and strategies, and there is no internal center holding them, those parts end up fighting for control. You felt this. The part that wants to binge and then the part that wants to heal. The part that wants comfort and the part that wants growth. The part that wants certainty and the part that wants freedom. The part that wants to disappear and the part that wants to be seen. Postmodernism names the fragmentation but gives you no path toward unity. It gives you the map of the cracks without showing you how to build a foundation beneath them. It validates plurality, but it doesn't teach leadership. It honors complexity, but it doesn't teach coherence. It breaks the illusion of oneself, but it doesn't help you to form a healthier relationship with the many selves inside you. And that's not enough. Not for people who want to live with intention. Not for people who want to grow. Not for people who are tired of feeling like they're made of loose threads instead of something solid. Postmodernism is a brilliant scalpel, but it is not a blueprint. It can diagnose, it cannot build. It can reveal the truth, it cannot teach you how to live inside the truth. And that is where most people get stuck. Not in the collapse of the old stories, but in the absence of anything to replace them with. But here's the part I want to hit for you. You don't need to go back to the old world. And you don't need to lose yourself in the chaos either. There is another way to live, a way to hold complexity without collapsing under it, a way to feel the tension of multiple parts without being torn apart by them, a way to build meaning even when certainty isn't on the menu, a way to stay grounded in a world that refuses to stop shifting. You don't need one truth to stand on, you need a center. You need a way of leading yourself from the inside out. And when that happens, complexity stops feeling like an enemy and starts becoming the raw material of your life. Multiplicity without leadership becomes chaos, and chaos without a center becomes paralysis. Postmodernism can reveal the cracks, but it doesn't teach you how to stand on the fractured ground. It shows you everything that's unstable, but it doesn't show you how to move through instability with any kind of integrity. And there's something else that I want to say here, because it's impossible to talk about this without naming the cultural tension we're all living inside. The people who complain the loudest about postmodernism ruining society, they're often the ones living the most postmodern lives. It's almost poetic. They talk about objective truth while reshaping reality every time it threatens their identity. They preach personal responsibility while refusing to acknowledge any consequences for their own behavior. They demand a return to traditional values while building entire identities out of curated narratives, conspiracies, and emotional projection. They rail against relativism while bending facts until they match whatever story feels safest that day. They say the world has lost the truth, and then refuse any evidence that challenges the truths that they've manufactured. It's interesting, isn't it? The very thing they're terrified of, a world without a single stable narrative, is the world they're already living in. They're not defending truth. They're defending certainty. And certainty sure feels good when the world is shifting under your feet. But certainty built on denial, it isn't truth. It's escapism dressed as righteousness. And I don't say any of this to score points or to make some cheap cultural jab. I say it because this mindset is everywhere, not just in the groups we like to point fingers at. Because we see it in politics. You see it in religion. You see it in wellness. You see it in fitness tribes. You see it anywhere identity feels fragile and people reach for something absolute to hold on to. When a world becomes too complex, people don't become more grounded. They become more ideological. And ideology is just fear dressed up as purpose. They stop relating to truth and start relating to whatever story stops their anxiety. And the danger isn't the ideology itself. The danger is the rigidity, the inability to hold nuance, the refusal to acknowledge contradiction, the hunger for one clean narrative that makes everything feel simple again. But life isn't simple. Identity isn't simple. Truth isn't simple. And pretending otherwise doesn't protect you from complexity. It just leaves you unprepared to navigate it. You don't need a return to some imagined past. You need a relationship with the world as it actually is. Because the world isn't going back. The narrative isn't going to simplify itself for anyone. So the question becomes, how do you create a center strong enough to move through complexity without collapsing into rigid belief or drifting into meaningless? That's the real work. Learning how to lead yourself in a world that refuses to stay still. So I want to pause us here. Not because there's nothing more to say, but because we've said exactly what needed to be said for this moment. If you're feeling a little unsettled right now, that makes sense. If something in you feels seen, named, or quietly stirred up, that also makes sense. This episode wasn't meant to leave you feeling resolved. It was meant to leave you feeling oriented. Oriented to the fact that your struggles aren't random, that your fragmentation isn't failure, that the pressure you feel isn't a personal flaw. It's the psychological cost of living in a world that no longer offers one stable story to stand on. Postmodernism helps us see that clearly. It names the cracks. It exposes the illusion. It explains why the old rules don't work anymore. But seeing the cracks isn't the same as knowing how to stand on fractured ground. And that's where we stop for today. In the next episode, we'll talk about what postmodernism can't give you and why awareness alone isn't enough to live a meaningful, grounded life. We'll talk about how to build a center when certainty isn't available, how to lead a self made of many selves, and how to move forward with integrity inside complexity instead of collapsing under it. For now, just notice what this conversation stirred up. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to resolve it. Let it sit. Because sometimes the most important work isn't finding answers. It's finally asking the right questions. I'll meet you in the next episode. And remember, the awakening isn't a single moment. It's a lifelong practice. Awaken yourself, awaken your genius, awaken your power. Walk your path with intention, and I'll meet you along the way.